I always thought the most dangerous moments happened suddenly, but some people wait to get even. Hi, I'm Timothy, and today I'm sharing the worst revenge deaths. From a man who shot his wife over a GoFundMe, to a man who pushed his best friend into open water and never pulled him back. It was August 7th, 2022, Tulsa, Oklahoma, a residential neighborhood on the east side of the city, a single-family home on a quiet street. Nothing about the morning distinguished it from any other Sunday. Brian Teal was 40. He had spent most of his working life as a long-haul truck driver, covering interstate routes out of Tulsa for a regional freight company. It was steady work, and he was good at it. 2 years earlier, at 38, he had been in a car accident that resulted in the loss of both legs below the knee. He was admitted to a rehabilitation facility for long-term recovery. The injury ended his career immediately and completely. The road back was not short, and it did not lead back to what he had before. Diane Teal was 37. She was his wife at the time of the accident. She visited during the early weeks of his admission, then less frequently, and then not at all. While Brian was still in the facility, Diane set up an online donation campaign in his name. She presented it to their community as a fund to support his medical costs and eventual prosthetic needs. The campaign raised approximately $19,000 from people who knew them, had worked with them, or had simply seen the appeal and responded to it. The money was withdrawn. None of it was documented as having gone toward Brian's care or prosthetics, and no formal investigation or recovery of the funds was recorded. Around the same period, Diane began a relationship with another man named Troy. She moved him into the marital home. When she eventually left, she left the state entirely, taking Troy with her, and stopped all contact with Brian. I want to be fair and consider every angle, but I've seen many cases like this and can't find a different interpretation. She used his injury to raise money, kept it, moved another man into their home, and then left the state. I tried to find a charitable read. There isn't one. Brian learned about the campaign the way he learned about most of what had happened during that period, indirectly and late. A former co-worker from the freight company who had donated reached out to ask how the prosthetics were going. The question landed without context on Brian's end. He had received nothing. The conversation opened up the fuller picture of what Diane had done with the funds. He did not pursue formal legal action against her. He did not make public statements. He continued his recovery through a nonprofit mobility assistance program, eventually received prosthetic legs, and worked through the extended rehabilitation and training that followed, including adapting to drive again. The prospect of returning to long-haul driving was gone. He said little about Diane to the people around him during this time. That silence is the part that should have told everyone something. He located her through her social media profiles. She had been using a modified version of her name, but the profiles were publicly accessible. He identified the residents. Several weeks passed between that point and August 7th with no documented contact between them. I genuinely cannot tell you what those weeks looked like inside his head. But 14 hours is a long time to be alone with a decision and still make it. On the morning of August 7th, Brian drove approximately 14 hours through the night from out of state. Arriving at the residence the following morning, he had made no prior contact. He parked, approached the front door, and knocked. Diane answered. Troy was inside the residence at the time. At the doorway, Brian shot Diane. She sustained fatal injuries on the threshold of the home. Troy was not physically harmed. Brian did not leave the scene. He placed a call to emergency services, provided his location, and identified himself and what had occurred. Law enforcement arrived and took Brian Teal into custody without resistance. Diane Teal was pronounced deceased at the scene. Brian provided a full statement acknowledging responsibility for the shooting and offered no account that contested the facts of what had happened. He had no prior criminal record. He was charged with first-degree murder. At trial, he offered no substantive defense contesting the underlying facts. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. During sentencing proceedings, the court heard evidence relating to the donation campaign, the withdrawal of funds raised in Brian's name, and the pattern of abandonment that followed his injury. The court noted those circumstances in its proceedings. They did not alter the charge or the outcome. This is what I find so sad. He drove 14 hours, knocked on a door, and threw away the rest of his life. Brian's story ends with a man losing everything. The next case begins quietly. Two men in a boat before sunrise, unseen by anyone else. What happened took time to reconstruct, but once it was, the pieces pointed in only one direction. It was October 11th, 2014, Lake of the Ozarks, Central Missouri. Early morning, before most people were awake, the water was flat and cold, sitting in the low 50s. The inlets were quiet, with no boats close enough to notice them. Daniel Price was 41. He ran a small auto repair shop with his childhood friend Marcus Hale, who was 40. The two of them had known each other most of their lives. When Marcus hit a serious financial collapse years back and had nowhere to turn, Daniel was the one who stepped in. He covered him, helped him get back on his feet, and later, when the shop started doing well, brought him in as a full partner and gave him half of everything they had built. Marcus was so close to him that when Daniel got married, there was never a question about who would stand beside him at the altar. That was the history between them. Sometime in the months before October 2014, Daniel started noticing money going missing from the business. He raised it with Marcus directly. Marcus denied it. The conversation ended there, but the irregularities did not stop. Around the same time, Daniel found out that Marcus had been having an affair with his wife. He didn't confront him about that. He said nothing, changed nothing, and kept showing up to work every day as if the two conversations had never happened. The fishing trips continued on schedule. Same lake, same small boat, same two men. What Marcus did was unforgivable, but I kept coming back to how Daniel didn't react at all. From what I've seen, that kind of silence usually isn't nothing. The morning of October 11th, they launched before the sun came up onto calm water with low light and no boats within that inlet. They moved into one of the quiet stretches away from the main channel, the kind of spot where sound didn't carry far and boats rarely passed through. At some point during the outing, Daniel said something felt off with the engine and asked Marcus to take a quick look at the prop. Marcus moved to the back and crouched down toward the water. Daniel came up behind him and pushed him over the side. The movement was quick. Marcus was not a strong swimmer, and Daniel had known that for years. The cold water pulled an involuntary gasp out of him the moment he went in. His breathing became rapid and uncontrollable, and he thrashed hard, trying to get some kind of footing in the water. He grabbed for the side of the boat and looked up at Daniel. Daniel said something, fragmented, uneven. The money, his wife. Marcus was already choking between breaths, his movements breaking apart as panic and cold worked against him together. His head went under once and came back up, struggling to stay above the surface, and after several more seconds, it did not come back up again. I have to be honest, that detail is the one I couldn't move past. He said something. He needed Marcus to know why. That moment shows this wasn't an impulse. Daniel moved to the front of the boat, steadied it, then started the engine and headed back to shore. He docked, walked to his car, and drove home without calling anyone or reporting anything. He later told investigators that Marcus had fallen in and he hadn't been able to find him. He went about the rest of his day quieter than usual, answering questions late, but otherwise keeping to his routine. It was Marcus's wife who raised the alarm later that day when he did not come home and could not be reached. A check of the lake area was initiated and the boat was located and accounted for. Search teams went out across the surrounding water, and after a coordinated search of the inlet, Marcus was located. Paramedics arrived on scene after Marcus Hale was pulled from the water in the same inlet where they had been fishing. There was nothing to be done. The cause of death was determined to be drowning, with cold water conditions contributing. Investigators began to see that Daniel's account did not align with the established timeline, and physical evidence contradicted the sequence he described. Financial records and phone data identified both the missing money and the affair as prior points of conflict. Daniel Price was arrested and charged with homicide. The overboard event was determined to be intentional. His wife filed for divorce while he remained in custody. The man he gave half his business to, the man he called his best friend. Daniel made sure he went under, then drove home and waited. I've sat with this case for a while and still can't decide what's worse, what Marcus did or how calmly Daniel answered it. The next case is different in almost every way. But someone decided that what happened to them justified what they did next. A college campus in Arizona, a locked conference room, and a professor who did her job and paid for it. It was April 22, 2015, Mesa, Arizona, a community college campus on the east side of the city, a standard academic building with administrative offices, classrooms, and a conference room used for faculty meetings and student appeals. Nothing about the building or the day distinguished it from any other point in the semester. Phil Dawson was 24. He was enrolled part-time while working night shifts to cover his living expenses. He was behind on coursework and behind on bills. The two things fed into each other in a way that had been building for some time before the spring semester came to a head. Carol Reyes was 38. She had been teaching at the college for 9 years. She followed procedure. When Phil submitted his final paper and the plagiarism detection system returned a similarity score of approximately 74%, she reported it through the appropriate channels. That was her job, and she did it. A failing grade was issued. Academic probation was applied. Phil's financial aid eligibility was revoked as a direct result of the academic standing violation under the college's satisfactory academic progress policy. I understand that Phil has been under a lot of pressure. What I cannot get behind is what he did next. The consequences landed hard. He could no longer meet his rent obligations. His housing situation became unstable. His employer reduced his hours around the same period. The pressure was real, and it came from multiple directions at once. What Phil did with that pressure was direct it toward Carol Reyes. He did not frame what happened as a consequence of submitting work that was not his own. He framed it as something she had done to him personally. That distinction mattered in the weeks that followed. He began appearing on campus outside his scheduled hours. He attempted on more than one occasion to revisit the academic decision through informal channels, approaching staff and raising the matter in ways that fell outside normal procedure. He made clear in those interactions that he believed he had been targeted. The behavior was noted by at least one staff member, but was not formally logged or escalated. It did not at that point meet the threshold that would have triggered a referral to the college's behavioral intervention process, and no risk flag was placed on his file. Phil finally submitted a formal grade appeal. He requested that Carol Reyes be present at the meeting. The request was accommodated. A conference room was scheduled in the administrative wing. The room was an older facility, fitted with a privacy lock on the interior handle, a feature common in multi-use administrative buildings of that age and layout. 2 staff members were assigned to attend alongside Carol. The meeting began as a standard appeal review, limited in scope to the grade, the plagiarism finding, and the applicable policy. Nothing in the opening of the meeting deviated from normal procedure. At some point during the meeting, it became clear that a key piece of supporting documentation had not been pulled into the digital record and existed only in a physical file held in a separate office down the hall. Both staff members stepped out briefly to locate and retrieve it. The interval was brief. While they were outside the room, Phil Dawson engaged the privacy lock from the inside. Carol Reyes was alone with him in the room and could not leave. What followed was what no one saw coming. An altercation began when the discussion turned back to the grade and the plagiarism finding. Phil Dawson grabbed Carol Reyes and forced her head into the edge of the conference table. The impact was significant. He did it more than once, with enough force to cause severe head trauma. She lost consciousness and did not recover. She fell to the floor unconscious. When the staff members returned to the conference room, the door was locked and there was no response from inside. Campus security was contacted and forced entry was made. Phil Dawson was present and did not resist. Carol Reyes was found unresponsive on the floor. Emergency services were called, but there was nothing to be done. Carol Reyes was pronounced dead at the scene. Phil Dawson was detained without incident and subsequently charged with first-degree murder. In a statement, he indicated that he believed the academic consequences had been unjust. The college revised its meeting protocols and placed restrictions on closed-door proceedings conducted without continuous staff presence throughout the duration of any student appeal or disciplinary review. I wonder how it might have turned out if the staff hadn't stepped out, but there's no way to know. Meanwhile, I contemplated adding the next case. It is about a grievance that started somewhere else entirely. A man who spent years quietly positioning himself to do something about it. This one takes longer to build, but it gets there. It was May 3rd, 2019, Houston, Texas, a private residence on the west side of the city. The evening function was scheduled to begin at 7. The kitchen was domestic, the counter space limited, and no allergen handling controls had been established for the evening. Tools and surfaces were shared between dishes and between staff, creating a risk of cross-contamination. Ethan Cole was 33. He had spent 6 years working in a Houston restaurant owned by a man named Victor Alvarez. He was the first employee Victor ever hired. In the early period, when the restaurant had not yet found its footing and the margins were thin, Ethan was there. He learned the kitchen under Victor, followed his standards, and stayed through the difficult stretch when a lot of people would have left. Victor trusted him during that time in ways he did not trust many people. The break came during year 6. A health code issue surfaced inside the restaurant. The details of the violation were documented and known to both men. Victor wanted it handled quietly. Ethan refused. What followed moved quickly. Victor accused Ethan of theft shortly after. The accusation was never substantiated in any formal proceeding, but it did not need to be. It circulated. Houston's catering and food industry was connected enough that the name spread before Ethan had a chance to respond to it. Work dried up. He lost his position. He lost the professional standing he had spent 6 years building. I have to be honest. The accusation doing its damage without ever being proven is the part of this that sits badly with me. At the time of the May 2019 event, Ethan's wife was undergoing cancer treatment. The costs were ongoing and significant. The termination and the accusation had pushed the household into financial collapse. They lost their housing. Ethan had spent the period between his dismissal and the spring of 2019 rebuilding slowly through freelance catering contracts, taking whatever work came through contacts who did not always vet him closely or ask about his history. That is how he came to be in Victor Alvarez's kitchen on the evening of May 3rd. Victor had contracted the function through a private events company. The company sourced staff through their own network. Ethan had worked several prior engagements through that same company and had established enough of a record with them that he was given lead cook responsibilities when available. For the May 3rd event, he was assigned that role. In that capacity, he held direct responsibility for menu execution, station assignments, and food preparation from start to finish. The company never knew both Ethan and Victor had any past relationship. Victor had a severe shellfish allergy. It was not a minor sensitivity. The allergy was documented and widely known among people who had worked with him or been around him socially. He carried an epinephrine injector. He had made the allergy known to staff at his own restaurant for years. It was the kind of detail that people in his circle did not need to be told twice. Ethan had worked in that circle for 6 years. The evening menu included a shellfish appetizer. As lead cook, Ethan held direct responsibility for that menu. He prepared the shellfish course himself. The dish was plated under his supervision and moved to service with the rest of the first course. The kitchen was busy, and the other staff were directed through their stations by Ethan throughout the evening. Preparation tasks ran across shared surfaces and overlapping work lines. Victor consumed the appetizer at his own table, in his own home, unaware that it had been exposed to shellfish. Within minutes, the symptoms began. Initial accounts from those present suggested the reaction was not immediately recognized for what it was. His breathing changed and his throat tightened before the severity became apparent to the people around him. An epinephrine injector was present on site, but the severity of the reaction was not recognized in time for it to be administered before loss of airway control. The reaction escalated into full anaphylaxis before emergency services could be reached and respond. Paramedics arrived on scene. There was nothing to be done. Victor was pronounced dead that evening. The cause of death was anaphylaxis consistent with acute shellfish exposure. Investigators were unable to recover uncontaminated food samples for definitive testing, and no conclusive forensic link was established between a specific preparation step and the point of exposure. The prior relationship between Ethan Cole and the victim was identified through employment records and confirmed through multiple industry contacts. As lead cook, Ethan held documented responsibility for the evening's menu and its execution. The case was referred for prosecutorial review. Charges were filed at a later stage. Ethan Cole was identified as the primary person of interest and subsequently taken into custody. His wife remained in active cancer treatment at the time of his arrest. I am not in a position to say what Ethan Cole did or did not do in that kitchen, but I can tell you that none of them deserves what they got. Ethan Cole walked into that kitchen through a gap nobody caught until it was too late. The last case I want to cover started even further back, years before anything happened. It was June 14th, 2017, Surrey, England, a residential property belonging to the Calloway family. The garden was landscaped and maintained, with a small culinary herb section along the south-facing border. No labeling system had been put in place and no separation existed between the plants growing there. Arthur Bennett was 63. He worked part-time as a gardener, quiet by nature and reliable in his habits. He had not always lived that way. Some years before, his wife and daughter were killed in a road traffic collision. They had been traveling together to collect his daughter's wedding gown ahead of her upcoming marriage. The driver was Joshua Calloway, 29. He was known locally for reckless behavior behind the wheel and had accumulated a prior record that reflected it. The case was prosecuted, but the Calloway family had money and connections that reached into the local legal and civic structure, and those connections were used. The case concluded with an outcome that bore little relationship to what had been lost. Arthur did not make public statements. He withdrew from most of his previous social life and took on low-profile work. He was hired by the Calloways some time later. He did not identify himself to them or disclose any connection to the case when he accepted the position. The family had not appeared in court during the proceedings in any meaningful capacity. They had managed the situation from a distance. Through representatives and relationships, Arthur's name would have meant nothing to them. He arrived at the property, kept his head down, and worked. He remained in the role for just over 2 years and became an unremarkable presence on the grounds. He raised no grievances. He drew no attention. At the homeowner's request, he established a small herb bed along the south border, incorporating parsley, coriander, and several other common culinary plants. The family took to using the herb bed regularly. They harvested from it for their own cooking, incorporating it into their household routine with some frequency. It was during this period, after the family had established a clear and consistent pattern of harvesting directly from the garden, that a plant later identified as poison hemlock became established within the bed. It didn't stand out. It blended in closely enough with the other herbs to be missed, especially by someone harvesting quickly. It wasn't labeled, it wasn't separated, and Arthur Bennett left it that way before he walked away from the job. Arthur Bennett left the position in the months before June 2017. He cited worsening pain in his knees as the reason for stepping back from the work. He was not present at the property on the date of the incident. By June 2017, the herb bed was in full seasonal growth. The household had developed a routine of harvesting directly from the garden as needed for cooking. On the morning of June 14th, Joshua's mother went out to the herb bed and cut a handful of leaves from the parsley section to use in a lunch she was preparing. There was no immediately obvious difference to someone harvesting quickly, especially with the plants growing closely together. The material was incorporated into the meal during normal preparation in a quantity sufficient to cause toxicity. Nothing about the dish appeared unusual before it was served and eaten. Joshua Calloway was home that day and ate the meal. Symptoms developed within approximately an hour, consistent with reported onset ranges for coneine exposure. What began as numbness around the mouth moved into the limbs. Breathing became labored. The body's ability to regulate its own muscular response broke down progressively and without reversal. Emergency services were contacted. Joshua Calloway was unresponsive by the time paramedics arrived. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Death resulted from respiratory failure caused by coneine toxicity. Examination of the herb bed confirmed the presence of Conium maculatum growing intermixed with culinary herbs in the parsley section. Investigators reviewed the full history of the garden's maintenance and identified Arthur Bennett as the person responsible for its establishment and ongoing care. His background was examined. The case was classified as a fatal toxic plant ingestion resulting from misidentified herb use in a domestic garden. No criminal charges were filed. I've sat with Arthur Bennett case longer than the others. I won't say what I think he did, but the hemlock was in the parsley, and he knew they would harvest it.